much. I'm excited to introduce David Glick. He's a senior who's finishing up his courses this semester. He came in to Sattler with some credits from studies before coming to Sattler, so he was able to finish here in the fall semester. And so this is perfect timing so that he can demonstrate for you all one of the culminating experiences for Sattler students, for most of them that would happen just shortly before graduation as seniors. And that is the opportunity to present their findings in a big research project that they do senior year that we call the senior capstone. And David has been a history major, so his research project involved traveling to a few different places to interview people and find primary documents, letters written by people who have lived and worked to help build the church in another country, in this case the United Kingdom. So really excited to hear the results of his study, and I'll be reading a 70 to 75 page paper that he'll give me by the end of the semester in 2 weeks, but he'll give you a capsule of that narrative. So yeah, let's give David a hand.
All right, well, hi everyone. My name is David and I'm a history senior here at Sattler College, and this is a presentation of my history capstone project. So I've titled the project From Mennonite to Anabaptist, a Christian Movement in England from 1944 to present day. And my thesis is as follows. The post-World War II Mennonite mission in England birthed an Anabaptist movement. As the mission matured, native British leaders emerged, and the movement increasingly adopted an Anabaptist identity over and against a Mennonite one. So, an overview of the presentation today. We'll do a bit on the religious background in England at the time of the Mennonite mission. We'll talk about how the Mennonite mission started and how it grew, how it went from a mission to a movement, and then at the end, a few missiological takeaways. My project by the numbers, so as Dr. Lehman mentioned, probably about 70 or 75 pages of writing. I did about 22 interviews. 18 of these were with British Anabaptists, and 4 of them were with North American Mennonite missionaries or people connected to these missionaries. 29 hours of archive research. Days of travel, 19. I spent about 2 weeks in England doing interviews and research, and I spent a week in Indiana at the archives of the Mennonite Church USA. Books or papers read, about 31. This was the fun bit. Hours of research and writing, about 450. And many, many cups of tea. So, in 1974, there was a British missionary living in India. He hopped an overland bus and headed back to his native England for retirement. His name was Leslie Newbigin, and he was heading back to Britain after 40 years in India. And when he got back, he was unprepared for what he found. So in the 40 years that he'd been gone, England had changed a lot, especially religiously. Essentially, when he left in the 1930s, it was a Christian country. And when he came back in the 1970s, it was a secular one. He writes about how after he returned, he would do evangelism on the streets of Birmingham, and how the Muslims and the Hindus that he met were often receptive to the gospel, and how the native British people that he met were hostile. He never quite got over his shock, and he spent the rest of his years alive thinking and writing about this question. What would be involved in a genuine missionary encounter between the gospel and modern Western culture? You have to imagine the strangeness of this question. This is the 1970s, and virtually no one is talking about what it would mean to re-evangelize the West. It's unthinkable. But Leslie did, and he kept on asking. And of course, today, this isn't crazy talk. We do think about this question today. And why do I tell you this anecdote? For 2 reasons. First, I want you to know the passion that drives my research. I think a lot about this question, probably nearly every day. And I think that the church should be thinking about this question too. But second, I think this gives us a bit of a window into the religious environment of England at the time of the Mennonite mission. I'll use a few data sets to make my point further. So the first one is one on church attendance. The blue lines are church attendance in 1980. The black lines are church attendance in 2015. There are a few interesting points here. The first line is Anglican, so the Church of England. And you can see attendance halved in this 25-year period. Now, if this data set went back to 1960, you would see an even greater decrease. So from 1960 to 1980, church attendance within the Church of England halved. From 1980 to 2015, it halved again. We also see that Catholics, a drop in attendance of about 60%. Methodists, again, a drop of about 60%. And down near the bottom, the United Reformed tradition, which is Leslie Newbigin's denomination, about a 75% drop in church attendance over 25 years. Here's a second data set. Notice that the question changes. It's not about church attendance anymore, but it's about religious identity. But it is about the same time period. So the blue line is Anglicans, and it does about what we'd expect. So in 1983, about 40% of British people identified as Anglican. By 2018, that number is down to about 15%. The Catholics are the black line, and that one doesn't drop as much. And so without doing further research in the data, we can infer basically this, that Anglicans have largely stopped attending church, and they've largely stopped identifying as Anglican. Catholics also have stopped attending church, but mostly continue to identify as Anglican. The most telling line, though, is the red one. This is people who answer no religion in the census. So in 1983, you can see it's about 30% of British who say no religion. By 2018, it's about 50% of British who say no religion. For comparison, in the United States, this number is about 25%. But let's go back to the first data set. You can see that not all of the trends are negative. So Baptists near the top have largely held their own over these 25 years. There's Orthodox Christians who have more than doubled in these 25 years. Pentecostal Christians, there's more church attendance over these 25 years. This is largely because of Caribbean and African immigration into England during this time. And then lastly, this one is interesting, new churches. This is a loosely affiliated group of post-charismatic churches, a lot of them house churches, largely evangelical, most of them very excited about radical discipleship and about intentional community. And interestingly, their founders were very influenced by Anabaptism. So we see some signs of small pockets of renewal within the negative trends. And it's my belief that the movement of Anabaptism in England during this time, small that it was, constitutes a very real part of this small pocket of renewal, hence my project. So to start at the beginning, the Mennonite mission in England was born from MCC, Mennonite Central Committee work, relief work during the war. And they had a small team of relief workers there as the war came to an end. In 1944 and 1945, as the war ended, they sent in hundreds of relief workers along with rebuilding supplies. And the mission agencies of the Mennonite Church saw this as an opportunity. So we see from their meeting minutes in 1945 this quote, "Whereas the war in Europe has come to an end, we recommend that we utilize the potentialities of both men and money in the hearty support of the post-war plans of expansion, which our mission board has outlined in meeting the challenge of a needy world." So the end of the war posits a mission opportunity. They send their first missionary, long-term missionary, to London in 1953, and in 1954 they purchase a large building and they open the Mennonite Gospel Center. Now, what is a Gospel Center? Well, it's not really an unusual strategy. It was used by the Mennonite Mission Board in other places. They did it in Paris and Brussels too, and it's used by other mission organizations in this time as well. It really represents a come and see approach to missions. We'll build a small Mennonite enclave in the middle of a big city, and people can come and learn about Mennonites and about Anabaptism. And in London, this building served two purposes for them. First, it was a Mennonite resource center, and so Mennonite Witness in London. It also housed a large library of Anabaptist books, which were very hard to come by in England at this time. These are mostly Herald Press publications. And secondly, it was a house of hospitality for international students, especially black students who at this time could not stay in the regular boarding houses in London. And Mennonites, as a tradition during this time, did not have the same inhibitions towards racial mixture that a lot of other Christian traditions still had. Here we see a church service at the London Mennonite Center in the early days. Notice the plain coat on the minister. Here's a Christmas dinner in the early days as well. Notice the mixture of races at the table. And this continued for about 20 years, this mixture of hospitality and resource center. And it wasn't until 1974 that they switched their mission strategies. And it began when the Mennonite Board of Missions called this couple, Alan and Eleanor Kreider, to come and serve as the center directors. What was the change? Well, previously, the center directors had really been house parents. They were hosts, they were library administrators. Alan and Eleanor, on the other hand, were teachers. They were scholars, and they taught at Goshen College in Goshen, Indiana, before coming to England. They were passionate Anabaptists, and they came for a teaching ministry. There's a small group that had been meeting at the London Mennonite Center on Sundays, and this became an official church during this time. They soon ran out of room at the center and started meeting in a rented space on Sundays. And about a decade later, they moved to a poorer neighborhood a few miles away and became the Wood Green Mennonite Church. In 1980, the center ended its hospitality ministry. Racism was less salient at this point, and black students could stay in the regular boarding houses. And the center, the building, became a live-in intentional community for the Mennonite Church's single students. And so through the 1970s and 1980s, we see a lot of changes. And all throughout this time, Alan Kreider starts to teach and speak in England. Very gradually, so it started with a few Bible classes at the London Bible College, and eventually he started getting invitations from churches to teach and preach. Happened very slowly. Words like Anabaptist, pacifist are very radical terms in England at this time, even within the church. Derogatory terms even. This didn't change until in the early 1980s, and Alan eventually became known as, quote, England's best known pacifist, and was called to different places to teach an Anabaptist view of theological topics. So we see in 20 years' time, the center gets used for hospitality, for a resource center. We see here a switch to a more teaching model. Anabaptists are seen as having something to contribute to theological topics in England. And it wasn't until the 1990s that we see the mission slowly morph to a movement. And it was really three events that did this. The first was that the Kreiders moved out of the London Mennonite Center after 17 years of ministry, for a few reasons, but the main one was to make room for indigenous British leaders to arise and take their place. This happened to some extent, especially in the church, less so in the London Mennonite Center. The second event was a British Anabaptist named Stuart Murray founded what's called the Anabaptist Network. And the idea was basically this. By now, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people across England and the United Kingdom who are interested in Anabaptism to some degree. Some of them through contact with the London Mennonite Center, some of them through Alan's teaching work, some of them through church history courses. And the idea was, what if we gave these people a way to find each other? What if we gave them a way to come together? And they formed small study groups in different cities in the UK. And interested people would find each other, come together, usually about once a month, usually over a meal, and discuss Anabaptist texts together. And it was a very grassroots way for a movement to begin. Now, the founding of the network is important for a few reasons. One, it's very unlike the London Mennonite Center, which has a big budget, it has staff. This is an institution that befits a movement. It has no budget, it runs on volunteers, it's decentralized, it's nimble, it's free-floating. And I think that's important. The second is that it's founded by British Anabaptists. There's no American money involved. And the third thing that makes it important is the choosing of the name Anabaptist to signify the network. And in this case, the term Anabaptist is really a way of indigenization. So I talked to Stuart about this, and he basically said, look, we are immensely thankful for the Mennonites. We were learning about Anabaptism, and we didn't have a lived model to show us what this looks like lived out in real life. And we came to the Mennonites, and they showed us what it looks like. But in fact, Stuart and other people who came to the center, for the most part, they didn't feel Mennonite. They didn't identify as Mennonite, nor did they necessarily want to become Mennonite. But what they did want is to link themselves to a historic tradition that captured some of the things that they were excited about, like peacemaking, like radical discipleship, like community. And so for that reason, the term Anabaptist after this point begins to get used through the movement. The third event was that in 2010, the London Mennonite Center closed its doors, and the Mennonite Board of Missions ministry in England ended. So what are the results of this today? Well, basically, throughout England and the UK, there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of quote-unquote hyphenated Anabaptists. These are all people who have come into contact with Anabaptism at some point in the last few decades and identify it with it to some measure. Some of these people would openly call themselves Anabaptists. Some of them would use terms like, I'm a Baptist, but I lean Anabaptist, or I'm an Anglican Anabaptist. And that might sound like a contradiction in terms, but for them, it's very meaningful. The Wood Green Mennonite Church closed in 2016, and there are other Anabaptist representations in England. There's a couple of Bruderhof communities. There is about 10 churches affiliated with the Zimbabwean Brethren in Christ denomination, which is a Brethren in Christ church from Zimbabwe, which now has a lot of immigrants in the UK, and they're starting their own small churches. And finally, there is a small group affiliated with the Nationwide Mennonites in the west of England. Incidentally, from what I can tell, the only group in this list who isn't connected to the others and doesn't affiliate with each other in somehow. They mostly are alone. So I think there's a lot of missiological takeaways from a study like this. I'll leave us with just two to think about. The first is about missional strategies. I use the word leavening to signify the approach that the London Mennonite Center took, that the Anabaptist Network took to missions, which is basically, let's build a community, we'll invite people to come to us, we'll do some teaching, maybe they can learn, maybe there are things for them to learn, and they can go back to their own churches and their own communities and take whatever they want with them back. And of course, it would be hard to say that this wasn't successful for them when you look at the thousands of people who were influenced by Anabaptism positively and who did carry that back to their communities. But I think it's hard, too, not to reckon with the fact that at this point, there are no living communities that came about as a result of this movement. There are no churches, and at no point was church planting a part of the missional efforts. And so I'll leave you to make of that what you will. The second point that I want to make is something that I heard from numerous people that I interviewed, which is basically this. Anabaptism as a tradition has a lot to offer places like England, places where people's view of Christianity is a state church that once was very connected to power and very influential, but now in most countries like England exists at the margins of society and is no longer influential. And of course, Anabaptism as a tradition is very accustomed to existing on the margins of society. In fact, it's all that they've ever known. And so their point is that some of the things that Anabaptists hold dear, a believer's church model in place of a church that's connected to the state, believer's baptism rather than infant baptism, and peacemaking or non-resistance. Some of these ideas look very different in a context like England, where church is now on the margins and people by and large don't identify as Christian. And for that reason, Anabaptism as a tradition has a lot to offer places like this. A few acknowledgments. Mr. Austin Lapp was my second reader for my project, and his knowledge of English grammar came in very helpful. Dr. Stuart Murray was very helpful from the British side of my project. He basically introduced me to all the people that I interviewed. Dr. Hans Lehmann was my advisor for the project, and without him, it would have failed many times over. A page of my sources. I want to leave us at last with Newbegin's question again. There is not a lot of data on modern missionary movements in the West. And I think the church, as it increasingly asks Newbegin's question, what would be involved in a genuine missionary encounter between the gospel and Western culture? I'm hopeful that studies like mine will be helpful as the church asks that question. Thank you.
For questions, if you'd like to ask David any questions that this prompted.
Jonathan.
I'm curious, can you speak at all to like what is Stuart Murray and his vision, like the Anabaptist network, like what's the current state of that? It seems like some of that's kind of fizzled down. Yeah, I don't know. Can you get any?
The network is facing a few issues. One, a lot of its members are older, and there doesn't seem to be a large influx of younger people that are excited about the same things. But they do have a significant amount of funds which came from the sale of the London Mennonite Center, and they're putting those into mission projects in different places in the UK, including a few church planting initiatives. So in the last few years, for the first time, there has been talk of church planting and some initiative in that direction. Yeah, and Stuart Murray in particular is very excited about that. Yeah. Philip.
So you mentioned about the nationwide group there in the UK, and you said they're isolated basically from the rest of those movements, or did I not understand that?
That was my impression based on my visit to them and my talking with them. Yeah.
How many congregations are there?
One. Yeah. Jonathan.
Yeah, so do you know, I don't, it's fine if you don't, but is, like, what do you know about, like, the state of Anabaptism in Europe as a whole? Britain, the only place where, like, stuff like this is happening, or are there movements like in Spain or Germany, Italy,
The model of a network has been used at other places in Europe, especially in the last decade, especially in Scandinavia and Southern Europe. But I couldn't speak to how many people are there that are interested. Zach, then Marcus.
There are two terms that I was interested in, leavening versus church planting. Could you explain that a little bit more and why you would choose the leavening word? And then is the term, and then this is just a yes or no, is the term hyphenated Anabaptist, is that coined in this movement, or is that something you came up with?
No, it's a word that I heard from them. It's a word that they use. Yeah, it's not my term, it's theirs.
Okay, got it.
Leavening.
And do you have a definition for what that is, a little bit more, hyphen, what they mean by it?
I'll give you two examples of people that I've come across. One is a professor of theology at Oxford University. One is a chief of staff to the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Both of these men are closet Anabaptists. Their words, not mine. If their views about Anabaptism, both of them, Anglican to this day, both of them did not baptize their children. If their views were more prevalent, it would probably spell some danger for their positions. And so I think that gives a little bit of nuance to the hyphenated Anabaptists. For the most part, these people still belong to their original church traditions. They didn't feel the need to form an Anabaptist community. Yeah. As for leavening, I don't know how much more to say about that. It's just a word that I think that befits the idea of let's not create new communities, but let's instill people with something if they desire it, and then send them back to be, quote, leaven in the dough. Yeah. Marcus.
Oh, I just wanted to say to Jonathan's question that I visited one of my friends in Austria a couple months ago, who is like he's putting out a lot of Anabaptist content on blogs and forums, and he's saying that like every year he gets like basically the interest he's getting is like growing every year. It's getting more. He puts his phone number out all the time, and it's getting more and more phone calls from people from across.
That's very interesting. Of course, the unique thing about a study in England is that unlike a lot of countries in Europe, it hasn't historically had a Mennonite or an Anabaptist presence, right? You have that in a lot of other places in Europe with roots that go back to the 16th century. In England, whatever little bit of Anabaptism that spread across the channel was soon drowned out by persecution, and it never took off there in the same way. And so for England, this is all very recent. David?
You mentioned three aspects of the ministry as it evolved, like the clemency/hospitality aspect, Alan Kreider and his wife's like scholarship that they brought, and then later like the grassroots connection. Was there any one of those three that was like worked better or more influential, or was it a combination of all three that you noticed?
Yeah. I think it was a combination that made certainly what's there today what it is. And in many ways, there's not that big of a difference between how the center worked and how the network worked in terms of their missional strategy. It was just that the center had a physical place that they invited people to. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. Yeah. Clark.
Was the lack of church planting intentional?
It seems to have been so. Yeah, for the most part. There are different people at different points in the movement who had some ideas about church planting. But in the case of the Mennonite Board of Missions, from what I can find, they decided based on the missionaries' input not to plant churches. Yeah. Go ahead.
So the London Mennonite Center was closed in 2010.
Yeah.
And I believe you said the funds from the sale of it were
Mhm.
used to fund Stewart's Anabaptist network. But these were two separate organizations.
Yeah.
Did the Mennonites decide to sell the center in order to fund the Anabaptist?
No, the sale of the center was unplanned. So there were some financial discrepancies that weren't apparent until the last minute. And they basically, I think it had been diminishing. Their influence had been diminishing for quite a few years before that, it seems like. But yeah, there was the treasurer was ill. There was a few things that came together, and basically they didn't realize they had to sell until they were almost bankrupt. But it means they ran out of cash to function, but they still had a large property to sell, right? So there are funds that came from that now fuel a lot of different mission projects that the Anabaptist Network is involved in. Yeah.
How providential.
Yeah. Tim.
Yeah, I had a question based on this idea of leavening and then the closet Anabaptists.
Yeah.
Stuff. Like, do you think that, would you say their impact was mostly on like other, like people who identified as Christian, who were curious about just an Anabaptist tradition? Or did their impact go beyond that to like this group of post-Christian people or un-Christians, non-Christians?
That's a really good question. I can only really find the former. So I think it was intended for Christians in a country that is post-Christendom, right, is largely secularizing, and to give them tools to think about being the church in that kind of context. Yeah. Go ahead.
The closing, do you know what was behind the closing of the Wood Green Church in 2016?
Basically just declining membership, until it wasn't feasible for them to be a church anymore. Yeah.
At the beginning, you had a slide with church groups and the difference over time, membership, and you said that I think it was like the other or independent. They grew. The rate of growth there was magnitude was much higher than the others. Or just your number.
Is this the one?
This is in England.
Yeah.
Where did you say the churches that you were talking about fell? Was it independent?
The churches that I was talking about?
Yeah, like the Anabaptist churches that you mentioned.
Well, there weren't
Or
really.
few churches, was that it?
Maybe. I'm not certain. There aren't a lot of Anabaptist churches, so they probably don't constitute
Like a
anything sizable on this
Okay.
scale. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm sorry if I misspoke, but I wasn't meaning to portray them anywhere on this scale.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, we have gone a minute past time, so
Okay.
we should stop. But thank you so much, David, for the wonderful work.
Okay.